Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Geekscape Book Club. Schedules get crazy. It's been a moment since you've had us, but don't worry. We've got some fun stuff in store for summertime. So just stick with us and all of that. My pal, the Robin to my Batman, the Bucky to my Captain America, Eric Conner will be with us shortly. But as we get started, and before we dive into this week's entry, I wanted to welcome our guest, Jeb Woodard. I hope I said that correctly. I don't know. I'm like, wait, am I forgetting? Is there a W I forget? Is it Woodward? I think it's Woodard, right?
It's Woodard. Everyone thinks there's an extra W, but there's not.
Yeah. Well, Jed, you and I were chatting beforehand about things not relevant to today's conversation, including Star Wars trade paperbacks, G.I. Joe comics, and all of that. So that conversation will have to wait. Take a moment and explain that you worked for DC Comics for 20 years, correct?
That is correct. I started out in production, and then I eventually was production manager for all the graphic novels and collected editions for DC. And then in 2015, when DC moved out to Burbank, I moved over and was the group editor for collected editions. So ran the editorial side, and helped decide what we published.
Yeah, and one of the things that you were involved in publishing in a compendium and a collected edition is something we're going to talk about. But first, let's bring our own personal Starman, the one and only Eric Conner. Eric, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jeb. Fabulous to see you as part of our Geekscape Book Club. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, so a lot of what we try to do on this show, and some weeks we veer from, or some months we veer from it. The idea is taking some of the iconic comic book runs that we know we should have read, but for whatever reason we never had. And my reason is usually very simple: that I was predominantly, almost exclusively, a Marvel guy. So people couldn't believe that I hadn't read Batman Year One, and I would say, it has a little DC in the corner, so I wouldn't have picked it up. And as I got older, there are things that I'd read. We try to do some of that, but I'm sort of intrigued with how we landed on this Starman run, which I found to be phenomenal. It's from 1994. And it's interesting because that means that it was published at a time where, had I dipped my toe in those waters, something like that, a little bit earlier, something like Sandman, I would have been like, oh, no, these are the kind of stories that actually speak to me, instead of the way I had kind of completely dropped off in reading comic books entirely by the end of the 90s. But that's what I'm bringing to this. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about, how works were selected for some of these collections. And since we're talking about Starman, talk about how you arrived to being involved in this project specifically.
Well, I can talk about, I fell in love with Starman in the 90s when I was in college. After it was like 40 issues in. Right. And back before collections were really a thing. And in college, when I had no money, for some reason, I always found a way to buy comics in college. I could barely afford food, but I had a $40 a week comic book habit, and I always did it. Money fell in my lap, and I did it. But I went scouring comic stores looking for all the single issues of Starman to catch up.
A very hungry young Jeb would be there, shaking from his lack of nutrients, but still getting his comic Jones.
I'll only speak for myself, but I still was buying comics when I was in college, even though a lack of money. I'm only speaking for myself. I find when you don't have to earmark any money to spend on taking someone out on dates, all of a sudden your budget has a little bit more flexibility. So it was really just looking out for myself. That's how I was able to do it. And the era that this came out is actually when I was in college. I started college in 1994. So you made time for Starman, but you're talking about wanting to go and get the back catalog, but you did it the old-fashioned way, the only way you could, right?
Yeah, and then when I was at DC, I was in production. they started collecting the Starman omnibus, which is nowadays an omnibus means an oversized, really monstrous 1,000-page tome. Back when this was published, it was a normal comic book sized collection, and there was the editor involved, Anton Kawasaki, who's a lovely man who I love dearly, who's no longer in comics, living his best life in Spain. And he was the editor on it, and he and I worked on all 6 volumes of this. And I was involved with dealing with pre-press and the artist there to help restore the film, and working with the printer to make it sure it printed right. And I jumped on the chance to work on it because I got to work with, my favorite comic, one of my favorite comics of all time. So, and I love it for the fact that you mentioned Sandman. So this came out right around when Sandman came out, and it's also just like Sandman, based on a golden age superhero. And James Robinson, the writer of it, he wanted to write a book that was not quite the mature readers like Sandman was and Swamp Thing of that era, and not normal superhero fare. He liked right in the middle, and that's what Starman is. And I love it. It's just as complex as a Sandman. One of the things I love that you having not read the run, in that first 12 issues, Jack Knight, Starman, he bumps into a woman in the circus.
Yeah.
And then she reappears a couple issues later.
Right.
That's his future wife, who doesn't.
Interesting.
Okay. He doesn't marry until like 40, 50 issues later.
I love the mental breakdown of this woman who, yes, reappears a few issues later, and it's like, well, I want to make sure I stay away from that bitch. If that's what she's like on a normal day, I can only imagine what she's like once a month. Yep. And it was in a way, it was kind of refreshing, because I think in the 90s, that flew without anybody blinking. I think now you might have to, you have to run it up the flagpole and maybe not be able to say that. But knowing now that that's his wife, it actually makes it funny. I assumed it was some adversary that he would one day fight, but your way makes it actually a little bit more interesting.
Almost every little thing that happens has payoff later on in Starman, just like in Sandman.
Like how, and Eric and I, we've only read through issue 11 for the sake of this conversation, but the poster who sucks people in, that starts showing up earlier. I like that. It reminds me of sort of the era of comics that I liked, where it's like, what just happened on that page? That was really weird. Oh, okay, we're back to what we were reading about, and you don't really think about it, but you kind of remember it the next time it happens. So I do love sort of getting these collections of this kind of long form storytelling. When you're reading them as collections, of course, it's a lot easier to pick up on some of those threads, instead of like, reading 4 issues took 4 months, and you're not necessarily sure of everything that happened over that time. You're going to see me pop off the screen for a second, but Eric, I want to have you share some of your first thoughts on Sandman in getting to read this, which I assume Starman. Yep, Starman.
No sand necessary.
No sand necessary.
Sand is coarse and tough.
Which we also did for this show. We did Sandman.
But
for Starman.
I worked on the Sandman, Absolute Sandman issues.
I still contend that we should go back and do the second volume of that collection. But Starman, I assume you hadn't read much of, right, Eric?
I had not, and I've listened to the song a million times. I've seen the movie with Jeff Bridges a million times. Never read this, and so I think it was great, Jeb, is when you and I first started chatting, you brought this one up first, because I said, "Oh, it'd be cool to have you as part of our book club that we do here." And the first title you mentioned was Starman, and I was like, "All right, cool." And it was kind of like your excitement for it got me excited for it. And then when I read it, I mean, that first issue alone. Oh, hello there. We have a canine visitor as well. All are welcome here. What I love in that first issue is, like, the guy you think is going to be the lead gets shot. within a few panels. And then his dad, you're not sure if he's dead or not. And it trickles down to the ne'er-do-well brother, who's a collector of assorted knickknacks, which of course I have no ability to relate to at all, as you can see from my backdrop here. Totally not like me. But I thought like that was such a great way to start a story. It was and I love that it's issue 0. But
yeah, that was actually the next thing I was going to bring up is it does feel like an issue 0. Now, obviously, you're involved in collecting it, but what is your understanding of why they thought it should start with issue 0 instead of, especially by the way, since there was so much focus even into the 90s of like, oh look, it's a number 1, you need to collect that number 1 and bag and board it. But this is a number 0.
It came out during 0 Hour. So and the 0 Hour event happened. Actually, Jack Knight's first appearance is in one of the issues, actually, the 0 Hour miniseries. In the original Starman Omnibus collection, hardcover collection, they have a little inset of it so you can see it. So all the issues, there was a Batman 0, there was Superman 0, Action Comics 0, all of the right after 0 Hour happened, they all kind of reset to 0. Not quite like New 52 when in 2011 when DC reset everything, but similar of nature. So
right.
And there's the artwork done by the phenomenally awesome Tony Harris.
Yeah, I find the artwork to be, especially sort of the initial arc in this series was just really compelling. And again, he's not somebody whose work I'd really seen before. But I think right away this story does grab you. It's sort of like, this idea, and my assumption is that Starman was a character who had probably kind of fallen by the wayside at this point. As the issues go along, there's references to past Starmen. We get to see one of them, at the circus and all of that. So how was this received at the time? Obviously, you're talking about how much you enjoyed it, but that was not even at the beginning of the run. You kind of jumped in later, right?
Yeah, I jumped in around 96, 97, so it was about 2 years into its run. I know it was well received, and I don't think it won acclaim. To be fair, Frank, I don't really know its initial run, but it was originally pitched. It came about because Starman previously there was multiple versions of Starman since the Golden Age Ted Knight Starman, which is Jack's father from the 40s, and they relaunched Starman multiple times. And what James Robinson did was he went there and took all of them and seamlessly created them and pulled them all in together. So all the various Starmen throughout the ages have appearances.
The guy at the circus, right, is one of them.
McCall, yeah, he's one of them. But there was a Starman called Will Payton. He was like a human from lived on another planet. Jack's older brother, who dies in the shot right here, he's a creation of this version, of James Robinson's versions. But then there was, I think there was another one. There was like 5 of them total.
Okay.
I think Jack Knight was the 5th one. And then there was also Stargirl later on, who inherits the mantle afterwards. And so he pitched to Archie Goodwin, who was the editor of the series, the famous Archie Goodwin, or Godwin. Something I can't remember.
It's Goodwin, yeah.
Goodwin.
And
my sister-in-law is Godwin, so that's why I cross wires there. I'm getting too old. But he was James Robinson attributes him a lot to the story. Like if in the original intro to the Starman Omnibus, James talks about how why he loves Tony Harris. The two of them never got along a lot. They didn't hate each other, but it wasn't one of those comic romances of a writer artist, he has lots of great things to say about him. Nothing bad. He just said that their relationship wasn't smooth, but Archie was like hard on both of them and pulled it forward. And he originally proposed a Starman series to Archie, and then they killed off Will Payton, and killed the series, and then that's when Archie came to him to relaunch it. So.
And that was not long before this, or before this series comes
Yeah, not
about.
long before. Yeah,
okay.
I don't know the exact timing of it, but it was not long before it. I've always wanted to go back and read those old comics, but never gotten around to them. So,
well, I guess I guess there wasn't a demand for collection, but it makes sense that it's tough because you can see how something like this, and again, it makes sense to compare it to Sandman, is when you initially start telling a story like this, before there's any buzz and people just decide to check it out, it's not what you're looking forward to. This one, it's definitely grounded in the superhero world, and I think it isn't interesting when you get the reluctant hero. That's always interesting, but to the extent of well, I'm not gonna wear the Christmas tree colored costume. I've got my own look, and even to the practical extent of like, hey, don't forget your jacket. It's like, no, I don't need that for this one.
Yeah.
So
I also
like he had the sheriff badge. And it's like, well, it's a star. I mean, that I thought was a great.
It's good
like
enough. What were you gonna say, Jen?
I just like his whole costume is like he wears the bomber jacket because it's cold up in the air. He has the goggles, the World War II aviator goggles, because the staff gets bright, and he gets a toy sheriff badge because he's Starman. And everything else is whatever he's wearing. It's just, I love that. And even his staff, his father had a cosmic rod that his brother has in that first picture, but he has an older version of the cosmic rod. And it's all like
the conventional one. Right, the one he got that was like extra long, almost like like something Aquaman would wield. And I think so this came out right, Jeb, 94 was what you were saying, right? So I think that was also something too that was very present in this, was the 90s of it all. Like you having this main character who I'm sure has a copy of Candlebox floating around somewhere in his record collection. Like this is a guy who's very much almost like grunge, but it didn't overdo it. It didn't make it. I mean, the fact that he's like a collector of yesteryear. I mean, he has a reference to Starsky and Hutch at one point. He's not necessarily only of the 90s, which I think was a smart move, but his attitude and even kind of the almost like ramshackle nature of his costume felt very true to the 90s. So I thought it was like a smart way to bring back this sort of legacy character and make it work in the mid 90s specifically.
It was. So I always loved how he's in the middle of a fight and he's thinking about all the deals he can make.
Well, I was thinking about that, as I was putting my thoughts together. I was reading it earlier that, he's thinking about a deal that got away, how he could have gotten a little bit more. And, it's
he's always haggling. I love that. Like his day job is very present in this storytelling.
Because he's an anti-hero. He didn't want to be, and that is prevalent throughout the entire issue. Like the entire series is 80 issues long. Like the main thing, and it always had an end. And once Jack Knight retired and he passed the rod to Stargirl, he hasn't come back. I've always loved that, and of course, it pangs me because I would love to have another Jack story, but it had a beginning, middle, and end. And
have they ever done the sort of the trick where it's like, well, here's a new story, but it's set during that continuity, or they just haven't? They've kind of left them untouched since then.
They've kind of left them untouched. The Shade, his which is another, like, you can't talk about Starman without talking about Shade, which is an old golden age Flash villain that James Robinson turned into this like immortal guy who's kind of quasi villain, and he has all these really massively powerful like shadow abilities that he can suck people into the shadow, and he can teleport, and he writes all these journals. That character has appeared otherwhere, and James also wrote later stories with McCall, who is the Blue Starman.
Oh, okay.
He was in a Justice League incarnation of the Justice League after Jack retired. So those issues are collected in the later run. There's a great Starman, Batman, Hellboy crossover.
Oh wow!
Cool.
And
when was that, Jeb?
God,
Around when? I mean, like year wise, was that?
I don't know. I'd have to look it up.
2000s or like?
No, it's in the 90s, I believe.
Okay.
I can tell you in 1 second. It was in
Where's our research team? Christian, where's our research team?
January 99 and February 99. Oh, trust me, I have too many years. I know exactly where to go on the internet to find this stuff out.
Yeah.
Mike's Amazing World of Comics. I love.
You were a few seconds ahead of me there. So yeah, that sounds interesting. And we've you got Cupcakes Corner with American Cupcakes saying hello. And great to see everyone. We're talking about the 1994 Starman series today. But even if it's not something you're familiar with, hang out with us. Cool spinner rack. It's fake, but Jeb's is real. You actually have a spinner rack, which you were showing me beforehand, which I'm trying to switch this up. There we go. Yeah. So you've got the G.I. Joe comics over there. That was what we were talking about earlier. So he's got the real one. I've got the one, the virtual one that I was telling Jeb is the one that I always want, is the one that says, "Hey kids, comics." You know, it's so let's go through the story a little bit. Eric, you sent some of your artwork, which is always, I think, one of the more interesting things, because I like going through and seeing what you've chosen and why. So this is obviously from the earliest part of the story. Jack's brother has been killed, but this is before his dad meets what seems to have been his end. And sorry, you couldn't even tell my virtual spinner rack was fake. Well, then I that's mission accomplished for today. But talk about reading.
Christian has good doctors.
What are your thoughts, and what spoke to you sort of about this part of the story early in the story, Eric?
Yeah, I have it here on my iPad too. Honestly, I always love moments like this in a comic, which it's more like about shape and shading than anything, and I just love the illustration, and I found a lot of this. It was interesting seeing their approach to the artistry of the illustrations of this. But I thought this was just such kind of like a great, almost like film noir kind of moment. Getting back to, like you're talking, it's sort of roots in kind of more golden age of comic books. This just felt like something I can imagine Batman walking by at any moment and peeking his head in and just saying hello, because of the shade and this almost like that Sin City feel of it. And especially because a fair amount of this kind of doesn't go there. And I that's what I found interesting. You talked before, Christian, about when you read this as a collection versus waiting a month for every issue, is I like how the storytelling even had guest illustrators along the way. There are 2 issues basically back to back that are kind of like sidebars, one with the 2 brothers in the cemetery.
Yeah.
And then the story of go ahead.
Let me just interject on that.
Please,
the fact that
please.
It's mostly black and white in the background with his brother in color, I thought was I love that illustration.
Yeah. And not to give, not to spoil it, but that is a recurring thing every year of story. 12 months. There is a times past, and Jack meets with his brother.
Like every year they would
every year he meets with his brother.
I was wondering that
it's a framing device.
Yeah, it's times past 95, and then he says, "I'll see you next year" at the end. So I was like, "Oh, I wonder if that happened." So that's interesting.
Oh my god!
And so there's a times past, and then there's also frequently I can't remember how often, but there's also they tell a story in the past. Like one of the last issues in this run, like 10 or 11, you see an original Starman story. And those are all built in specifically because even the best artists have a hard time doing 12 issues a year. So that's a built-in framing device to give Tony Harris extra time to catch up.
Well, I thought that was interesting specifically because the one you're talking about, sort of the flashback to Ragdoll, is issue 11. And, we're gearing up for what is the next arc. I peeked ahead in terms of, it's a multi-part, I don't know, 4 or 5 issues. And it's like, all right, well, we need to get ready for that. So let's tell this story, which, his dad essentially told that story, a few months earlier. But it was cool to get to see it. And, I don't know if those are golden age or silver age versions of those characters, but it was very cool to kind of see him, just the idea of like, oh yeah, I need reinforcements on this one. And, the idea, it's like, hey, all you had to do was call us. I kind of like that feeling, because it's like when somebody's a member of a team, it's like, all right, yeah, sure. But I like the idea of, I always appreciated crossovers that weren't done for sales reasons or, didn't necessarily, bring any new eyeballs to the book, but sometimes the story dictates, it's like, Uncanny X-Men never needed any guest stars. But there's a story I remember well that it made sense for Spider-Man to be there, and I as a kid, I was always like, oh yeah, this is what I like, and this is before we even got Flintstones Meet the Jetsons. So, this is before real crossovers.
The best crossovers are ones that impact the actual story.
Yes.
My favorite, none of them my favorite crossover all time, but my favorite comic that illustrated was Spawn Batman.
Right.
Where Batman throws a batarang at Spawn and it hits him in the head. And then Spawn, not wanting to waste any of his energy to heal himself, he ties it up. And from that point on, Spawn, to my knowledge, I didn't read that far past it, had a shoelace or something tied into his face for the wound. Wow. And it just stuck. It was a cross-company crossover, and it had impact on the character.
Which those usually don't have much bearing. It's I know that DC's putting out the omnibus collections of their various Marvel and DC stuff. So it gave me an excuse. It gave me an excuse earlier this year to talk to Chris Claremont about X-Men Teen Titans, which is a great book, but you don't feel any relevance to the continuity. And it's almost like DC's like, well, we kind of need Phoenix to be in this. Well, she's dead. All right, we'll figure it out. It was definitely one of those ones where you felt like it was.
We'll fix it in post.
Yeah, it's an Elseworlds outside of the continuity or whatever. And then it was the idea that the Titans Tower was also in the same city as the X-Men. And I'm like, all right, I don't know if I'm buying into that so much, but the one you're talking, yeah, no, it is fun. No, it's always fun when you get to see these characters. Absolutely.
And honestly, it's what like a season of TV will do. Like The Bear this season had more than one episode that were like set in the past. And it enriches the storytelling. And part of you is impatient, like it's like, oh shoot, well, what happened after last week? But there's something to be said for like those moments and those issues that sort of are maybe a little bit of a pause button on the bigger current story. But then when you come back and you hit unpause, all of a sudden it deepens and enriches so much of the storytelling. So even if there's a practical reason behind that, very logical practical reason to let the writers and artists catch up, I think it dramatically creates such a great tapestry. And I imagine for you, Jeb, for a collection, sort of the opportunity then to weave those stories into the bigger tapestry must be pretty enriching for you as an artist.
Yeah, having laid out many a collected edition and figured out what goes in it, it's an art form. And everyone has an opinion if you're right or wrong.
Comic book fans? I don't think so.
I'll imagine that. My favorite story is I was collecting Mark Waid's. This is a side note. Mark Waid's Legionnaires when Mark Waid took over Legionnaires, I love that run. And they released the contents of the first book or the second book. It only went to 2 books, sadly. And someone online on one of the many Legion of Superheroes fans, mind you, when I find Legion of Superhero fans where I love them to death, they're the ones who are the most like the comic book guy in Simpsons. Worst
Legionnaires ever.
Yeah, and someone pointed out that I missed a short story, and DC had these like every year, like Showcase 93, Showcase 94. It was a one each year had a issue a month, and it was short stories, and I missed one. And someone at work told me, and I said okay. And so I did my due diligence to find out if I missed anything else. And turns out it was the guy who ran the site had looked like the site was designed in the 1990s. I had to highlight all the text and copy and paste it into a Word document just so I could read it. And do my
AOL.members.com/9749 is my website.
Turns out that person who was a huge Legionnaires fan missed an issue that was in a story that was in the same issue he referenced that I missed. And it was just like, because you can miss, like, when fine tuning these things, you can make, like, everyone has an opinion. You can miss one minor thing. And I never let it bother me too much because of that reason. Like, everyone can miss. Everyone's human. So you just do your due diligence.
And I would assume that story, obviously wasn't incredibly impactful into what you collected, because otherwise you would have known about it. I mean, it would be apparent. And look, I mean, I think a lot of times when you're collecting whatever it is, there's times where, the annual makes sense to include. And there's other times where it's a different writer, a different artist, it's a standalone story. And sometimes, even though it costs twice as much as a regular comic, the annuals weren't worth buying. I'm not going to name any names, but there were times where I was like, what did I just buy this for? And also growing up fairly rural as I did, I was always furious that when I subscribed to a book, it didn't include the annuals. So then I had to figure out a way to like get to a store where I could buy it. And then you're that let down with it. But so, yeah, look, I mean, I guess, even the most completest everything, you're going to miss some stuff. But in terms of that, it was something you were talking about earlier. When you first start gathering everything for this, obviously, if you're collecting something now, something that's published in the last few years, it's all going to be easily accessible digitally. What do you have to do to get, even in the semi-modern times, in the 21st century, to get something from the 90s? Do you have to get original artwork, or is it really just what was sent to the printer back in 1995?
That's a very complex question. Everything is filmed back in the 90s and before. It's all about technical things. When you printed, like, you remember when we were kids, how comics had thick dots to represent all the colors?
I sure do.
And that's called a line screen. That's
right.
How, and in like the set, and also you go back far as in the the golden and silver age, there was only 64 colors available to the printers. And it was all, and you printed in CMYK, which, cyan, yellow, magenta, and K is black. And they could only do 25% increments. But for some reason, they couldn't do 75%. So that gave you 64. Then around Bronze Age, technology got better, and you had access to 75%. Then around in the late 80s, early 90s, you had the whole full gamut, and Photoshop was introduced, which creates a whole kind of problems for collecting 90s material, because they just would do whatever they wanted to do and not understanding the impact on printing. But like now our line screen for a printer is so much higher. But if you print those original dots now with this higher line screen, you get a moire pattern. So you have to do things like blur it out, recolor it completely. Right now, since I have left DC, I had a brief stint in the tabletop gaming industry, and now I'm running my own company called Creative Apocrypha, where I'm actually working with DC right now to restore old comics.
And sorry, the company's called Creative what?
Creative Apocrypha.
Creative Apocrypha. Okay.
Yeah. I'm doing freelance editing, and I work on anything from the comics and tabletop industry where people don't have the creative or production experience to do their work.
Right.
So like some of the work I and my team do is like we take old comics and you just apply filters and blur it out and redo it. Sometimes you have to reconstruct things. If you don't have the film, you take a scan of the original comic and you scan it in, and using Photoshop, you wipe the color out and then rebuild it back up. So,
I know in a lot of ways, a lot of creative, people are very wary of artificial intelligence, but this seems like an area where it could actually be useful when you're trying to take, a scan of newsprint to try to make it look
kind of translate it.
Yeah. Is that something that's involved, or are we staying away from Skynet in this industry?
I generally speaking, for the industry, I think a lot of people want to stay away from it because artists are really threatened by it, and I agree with that. When I started this company, I actually was like, well, I should look into it because AI has advanced so much, and I did a little bit of research in it. And most of the tools available are for photos, and when you use that stuff on comics, the problem is, comics are traditionally penciled, then inked, and then colored. So line art is king. So that ink line art is like is so important to the richness of a comic, unless you start getting into painted comics, and then it's a whole new ball game. But traditional comics, that line art is you have to preserve it, and if you use AI tools, that will like blur it out and not
that
work
makes
out.
sense.
So I use Content Aware a lot, which is a old AI tool, I guess you would call it AI, which will guess. It's a Photoshop tool that will guess. I can grab a section and say Content Aware, and it will draw it, and then I'll go in and hand draw it.
Well, I want to shout out in the chat, a friend of many shows that I've been involved with, the great Flobo Boy, said he loved the Starman Omnibus. So we're glad to see Flobo, and obviously make sure you go to flabido.com for new content every day. And I know I usually yell when I say that, but I don't want to scare anyone, Flobo, so you'll understand. I'm glad that we're talking about a book that he appreciate. I find all that stuff fascinating, sort of about collecting things, and a lot of the way that I found earliest stories were Marvel had a book called Marvel Tales, and at a certain point they started back, and Amazing Fantasy 15 ran forward for a while. Classic X-Men, because these were books I was like, I couldn't waltz into my comic book shop and be like, my good man, can I have Amazing Spider-Man 14, the first appearance of Green Goblin? Even in the mid-'80s, you could not walk in and get that at an affordable price. So I was always kind of fascinated. And I remember in one of the issues of Marvel Tales, they talked about how, because a book specifically, this is where I'm at, I can remember it's Amazing Spider-Man number 29, it had never been reprinted before. So they had to actually recreate some of the story. Like, they could look at the old book, but this is in the mid-'80s, so there's not the tools that you're talking about.
Yep.
I don't believe that Steve Ditko was interested in redrawing any of the panels for them at that point. So that's another obstacle you run into.
Well, even like DC's, I can speak for DC, like the DC archives, the old DC archives, the black with the white lines, like reprinting the original Golden Age Batman. When they started reconstructing that, they didn't have the film for Detective Comics 27, so they would use chemicals to bleach out the color.
Oh, wow.
Pull out the black, and then they would recolor it. And now with Photoshop, you just do that all digitally.
Right.
And speaking for someone who's reconstructed comics, funny enough, I'm not an artist. I went to school for writing. I've just used Photoshop my entire career. So and it's not really drawing, it's just knowing how to manipulate Photoshop.
Right. It's just knowing how to get the image you want by utilizing the tools, which probably there was probably a point where the industry was pushing against even Photoshop. And I'm sorry, Eric, I've cut you off twice in a row. Go ahead, sir.
It's okay. No, it's color correction in some ways too, right? It's like it's funny because I was thinking, even as you're bringing this up, like the idea of reprints in the 80s were so rare. I remember like I would occasionally come across a Mad magazine that was a reprint from an older Mad magazine, because they always had those collections, and how jarring it was when you would see a Mad magazine reprint from the 60s in the 80s, and like how you would almost look at it like, oh, it looked terrible then, but you realize, well, no, it just you're seeing, to put it in very layman terms, like a copy of a copy.
Right. It's a third generation Xerox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was curious, Jeb, if you had any time where, like, when you're doing this work, if any of the original artists, or even if you get kind of blowback from the fans, is like, well, excuse me, the color here, clearly this is magenta, not cardinal. Please explain this abhorrent use of color. Thank you.
I'm sure there was. I tried to stay away from the online boards sometimes. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. Yes, there was sometimes, like, depending on the level of book, because when you're doing collected editions, as much as everything's precious, you're also a machine. You're pumping out, like,
Right.
we did at the height of when I was running a collected editions editorial for DC. We were doing 350 titles a year. That's
350 collections.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
And so anywhere ranging from 128 pages to 1,500 pages. And that's a lot of material you're going through.
Yeah.
So you depending on the level of book, like an absolute, like, one of my favorite comics of all time is Wildcats. Jim Lee's Wildcats. Love Jim Lee.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
And I did the absolute. I was the editor on Absolute Wildcats. I went through, and because it was one of my passions, I went through and went on art collection sites. Jim happened to have all the original boards for issue number 1.
Oh, wow.
So I was given those, and handed them over to production and said, "You better lock these things away because nothing can happen to these things." Then I also, for when we didn't have film, I would go on to what is the comic auction website? I can't remember it. And I would
CGC.
No, not CGC. Heritage something.
Oh, okay.
And people would just post the boards they had in their collection.
Right.
So I would email them and say, "Hey, I'm I'm an editor at DC. I'm working on this trade. Can I get a scan of that page?" And usually I just pay them back by sending them a copy of the book that was
right. Yeah.
It was an easy thing to do. And that's why. So when you're missing some film, that's how you got it. And then there was also pages we couldn't find. And when I mentioned the 90s being, like with Photoshop, there was color holds. So color holds the term when, the black line is done in a different color. And those get blurry and wonky, and they use all kind of grads. Everyone loved a good lens flare in the 90s, which was just a pain in the butt to recreate and deal with.
You should have called J.J. Abrams.
Yeah, and so I was a friend of mine, Alan Pastelacqui, he's a colorist. He I'm sure he doesn't mind me name dropping him. He worked in with Wildstorm back in the day, and he would say, like, in the early 90s, they would run an effect in Photoshop in the computer, and they would go to lunch while the computer processed.
Also, it would render, like, it would take
render for the hour.
Oh, that's so funny.
Another time I'll tell you the story of the first JPEG I ever saw in 1992 and how long it took to download, and I'll tell you later what that JPEG
don't say what it was, but yes, it took.
I
know my audience. You've told me before.
I've told you, yes, I know my audience.
I'm gonna sidetrack for a second because you talked about Jim Lee, and I literally saw this yesterday. So you can, obviously you can commission artists for varying degree. I have a treasured Dave Cockrum drawing of Kitty Pryde that my dad paid for at a comic book convention. I believe it was $20. A commission from Jim Lee costs $20,000, and someone decided to get him to draw Bluey from the children's television show with a lightsaber, and you can see it's signed by Jim Lee 2024. And I love that someone chose to spend $20,000 on that because clearly they could. And look, I'm not going to lie. It's probably the coolest image of Bluey I've ever seen. And there's a lot of Bluey in my house with an almost 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. So I was just blown away that, of all the characters you could get Jim Lee to draw, he was probably like, oh wait, somebody wants me to draw Bluey. Oh my God, this is awesome.
Emma better appreciate that. That's all
I hope Emma appreciates it. That's a great point. Flobo Boy still in the chat. $20,000. I guess I can only get 2 of them. You're gonna have to start doing new content twice a day if you want that. Sorry,
Jim's
I need
also
to
one
go
of the nicest guy in comics.
who, Jim Lee?
Oh God, I love Jim. So
well, I'm glad to hear that because tremendous fan of his work, and you tend to hear that about him. It's there are other people whose work you can admire in different levels, and you hear different things about them. And someone who's a very divisive figure I know is Rob Liefeld, and I'm not going to talk about his artwork, but his podcast. He talks about feuds that you probably, not you personally, but some of our audience might not know existed. So he has an episode on John Byrne versus Todd McFarlane. He has another episode, Neil Gaiman versus Todd McFarlane. There's a trend. So anybody who is like as deep into comic book nerdy stuff, and he has all these articles that he reads from, and it's all, obviously with McFarlane, he remembers some of it, but it's so entertaining. Old interviews where John Byrne will very plainly tell you what he thinks of that crop of creators. But the reason I mention that, I don't think he has any feuds that involve Jim Lee. No. There's a lot out there that Rob has covered.
I can't imagine anyone having a feud with Jim.
Never heard of him.
He is literally one of the nicest guys. He when I was still early in my career, I played D&D, as you can probably tell from my backdrop, one of my close friends was Morgan Donville. He was the assistant editor on Batman Hush. I played D&D with Morgan, and Jim plays D&D, or used to back in the day. And so Jim invited Jim to play D&D with us. And so Jim came to my apartment in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and played D&D with us. And I was the DM, so I ran it. And he drew pictures for everyone's characters. Problem was, I was the DM, so I didn't get one.
so everybody else in the room has a great story except you.
Jeb the Gentle Giant. What about Jeb the Gentle Giant? Why didn't he just draw you then?
I don't know. I do have a Jim Lee sketch
of yourself.
I have 2. So I'm not going to complain.
For $5, I will draw anything you want. Literally anything.
Oh, wow. Now that's an enticing offer. So going through and doing a collection, and obviously because we're talking about Starman, you were familiar with the source material, but it obviously also gives you an excuse to kind of revisit it. And so that seems like one of those dream jobs if you'd been able to whisper to yourself in college when you're foregoing even ramen noodles so that you can buy comics. It's like, yeah, well, you like reading Starman. How about you get paid to collect Starman? What is it like when it is a work that you appreciate as much as this one?
It makes work not seem like work. But at the same time, it's still work. You get frustrated by it. I will in volume 6 of Starman Omnibus, there is a mistake I made that I will haunt me for the rest of my days. In Photoshop, when you're making a collection, if you're on the pencil tool and you click and then you hold down and click somewhere else on the page, it will straight line from the 2 points. I did that with about a 1/4 inch pencil at the time and drew a line straight through a panel, and none of us caught it.
I was going to bring this up a year ago, Jeb, and I just didn't know when was a good time.
This was his excuse. It's like, we'll talk about volume 1, and then he won't see it coming.
I assume it's been collected since I'm the one that broke down the Starman. There's it's the most recent way Starman's been published is Starman Compendium 1 and Compendium 2. I'm the one that broke those. Before I was laid off at DC in 2020, I broke those down. So what was going into each one, and then they published them afterwards. So I'm assuming after the fact that my old team, who I love really and who are phenomenal at their jobs, they corrected that. But I'll be honest, I've never gotten Starman Compendium 2 to check it.
Well, I think the least they could have. At least they could
give you one in a doggy bag or anything. Just on the way out.
No, I probably could get a copy if I asked them, but I never have. So
yeah, no, I get it. You don't necessarily want to ask for something like that. I get
well, like for instance, actually I was pointing, but it's not behind me, but the Absolute Sandman, that went to the volume 1 went to press when I was in Greece on my honeymoon.
Oh,
that partially destroyed my honeymoon because all I was thinking about was Absolute Sandman going to press. So.
Well, I also went to Greece on my honeymoon, but I will tell you, Absolute Sandman did not cross into my thoughts even once. So I enjoyed it enough for both of us. So as you're sort of working on this and you're talking about putting out 350 books a year, did you have time to, were you still interested in current books, or I'm a bit of a curmudgeon and I stick to sort of like a pre-2000 era. It's not that I read nothing from after that, but that's what I know the best. And I very tentatively will put a toe in. I'm much more fascinated on something from the previous century that I didn't know about, like this Starman collection. But were you keeping up then, and do you read anything now?
So I got my first job at DC Comics in May 2001. I scanned all the artboards and was digital archivist. I was heavily into comics then. It was my dream job. I read at that time I read DC and Wildstorm, but I used to have read Marvel. Batman No Man's Land storyline is what got me into DC. Over the years I still read almost everything DC ran. I got everything for free. And then as the years progressed, I read less and less. And then when I became group editor, I found tricks, like when I edited a book, I would edit it backwards when I proofed it because it would prevent me from reading it. And which slows down the process.
Yeah, I bet it does.
And then you learn tricks on how to read comics so that you don't have to read the entire run, because you just don't have time to read when you're working on a 1,500 page book. You just don't have time to read every single issue as much as you want to. You just don't. But by the time I left DC, I only read stuff that I worked on. And then when I left DC, I stopped reading. And then recently, actually, what I picked up was Starman. Before Eric approached me to be on this podcast, I picked it up and read it. And I got 6 issues into it, and then something typical ADHD mind, I was like, "Oh, shiny!" and went on to something else.
Sorry, it was this run of Starman that you just recreationally decided to read.
Yeah, but like I have so many thoughts and emotions built into Sandman, which I love. But since I worked on it, I ran production on all the Absolute Sandmans except the Sandman Overture, because by that time I was an editorial. I haven't touched Sandman in 20 years because I have too much thoughts. Still love it. Love everyone involved with the reproduction of the thing. I love everyone to death. But I can't bring myself to reread it, despite how giant of literature it is. So,
I mean, yeah, that absolutely makes sense, and it's very hit or miss on things that might grab you in the present day. I want to spend a little bit more time on talking about these issues, which I think that the easiest thing to say is to recommend that anybody who's enjoyed the conversation and the little snippets of it, this is well worth reading. I do actually want to revisit it even more than when we talked about Sandman. When we talked about Sandman, there was a little bit more of a natural ending there. These 0 through 11 all gear up towards, this next big confrontation that starts in issue 12. And I'm like, well, I kind of want to know what happened. So I can see going back into that. But Eric, you were trying to talk about, this was a panel that you selected, sort of this moment where Jack is talking about that, anybody who has family and dare I say anyone with kids, you can relate to, I don't always like you, but of course I love you. So of course he loved his brother.
Right.
So talk a little bit about this image that our visual audience is getting to see here.
Well, and this is also like a game-changing moment for him, because please, and either you jump in if I'm misremembering, but he, I think it's the first kill he does.
Yeah.
And and it's in such vivid detail. Like, he's been using this for using this new weapon of his for all sorts of things. But then in this moment here, kind of dead strike at his heart, and the guy just disintegrates into like nothing. And it's such, and this moment stays with him. I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about across these issues, is the idea that he killed someone. Sort of, he doesn't shake it off. Like, even though this is someone who did kill his brother, and he has every right to, I guess, get his vengeance, depending on your view of these things. But I think the idea that they made this panel like so specific, I think it took up the whole page, and it was,
I believe
like,
so.
really, you see, like, yeah, he's ending this guy's life, and so this weapon is truly being used as a weapon of destruction. But then morally, emotionally, how the next issue or next issues, he's still kind of haunted by this, and and I think that's one of the things that I thought the storytelling here would oftentimes surprise me with. And this is another moment I really enjoyed. And when did you get that tattoo, Dad? Like, those moments make it very human. That's always the thing. I think you and I, have talked for many hours about Marvel, and specifically the X-Men. I found like there was great little moments of humanity in this, and that's the stuff that makes it stick, that makes it much more than just the sum of its parts.
And to go back to the artwork that you were mentioning that a while ago when we went through 5 or 6 different tangents, the artwork was dark. There was the thing of Ted turning on the light was one of the images. And then you have the panel you just showed of the silhouettes, and then him killing him. Tony Harris used a lot of heavy inks and solid areas of black. And one of the things that James was really wanted to get was Starman, despite the fact that his name is Star, and it's therefore the sun is a star. Starman is basically a character of the night. The stars come out at night, and his one of James' opinion was the previous Starman run didn't work because it was always in the day. So the mood of bringing this character, especially red, green, and yellow into like this perfect. You pick the perfect panel to illustrate it. He pops right there. Yellow will pop on black any day than any panel.
Right.
So that really does bring the mood to it. It's very important. So like I mentioned, when he's killing that guy, there is, in that moment, there's very little black.
Right.
And it because of
it's all bright.
Yeah. So all color holds, and yellow and reds. So
it's worth going back again just for our visual audience to take a look at it and actually see. That's not what I meant to do.
No,
that's what I meant to do. I wanted to show it to everybody. So it's actually very interesting to think about it in that way. And the black and white issue that we referenced and we just had an image of, it definitely showcases sort of that very thing, sort of the contrast, and that's why I feel like it works so well. What were we?
And the whole issue is like that. That's what.
Yeah.
And I think it was almost like the courage of the conviction. Like, that's something you could say, oh, that's cool for a page or 2 pages. That's the entire issue, and it's this wonderful moral debate between these two brothers. And I think, having that patience to say, yeah, your reader will stick with that. They want this. Chris
Tuthill points out that is some quality artwork. And look, a lot of times there is an advantage, as much as I like sitting down with actual issues of comic books and flipping through the pages, there is definitely the visuals are able to pop so much more when you look at them digitally, and because they're able to be treated so much better. I will always enjoy the smell of old paperbacks and old comics and things, but I do realize how much more you can do with it. And as you referenced, Jeb, there's these standalone flashback issues, like the one that we're looking at now, which was sharing his journals. That's the Mist, correct? That's
no, it's the Shade.
Shade, sorry. And sorry, Chris had a joke. Good to see Jack Black on the show. I was worried he'd been canceled.
And that was my partner. I said nothing.
Yeah. It was always. But I appreciate. Sorry. So sometimes you just see a joke and you want to go with it. But so sorry. So this is the Shade, and he has those journals, and I mean, I found that to be interesting. Just sort of like, oh, I'm going to take care of this problem. Don't worry about it. And I'm going to ask you for something. And then in the end, he's talking to his buddy, Oscar Wilde. And he's like, I just took 10% of everything, which is better than the half he was about to lose. It's like, there's a shrewd businessman. You don't get to live forever. And was that was also an existing character prior to the series, right, Jeb?
Shade was, yes.
Shade was,
yeah. He was a Flash villain.
Okay.
But then Shade in story, he references like, oh, he beat me twice, once for real, once I just let him win, because that's the Shade.
Right. Yeah.
But like kind of like, if I mind me pulling somewhat side off that, like to mention Oscar Wilde. So when it's the issue 6 that he meets Oscar, that you have the whole issue with Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
And it's in 1882, and one of the key things I want to pull this, like one of the things we haven't talked about in Starman yet is Opal City.
Yes.
Opal City is a character upon itself, and it's very important to Starman because it's like this hodgepodge of cities, both old and new. Oscar mentions that it reminds him of Europe, but very American. And then you got to remember that this is written by a Brit, James, and suddenly I can't remember if he's Scottish or British, so someone will probably correct me, and I apologize to James profusely in advance.
In all of Europe.
But who moved to America in 1990, I think, to Hollywood, to Los Angeles here, and it's been here since, and to my knowledge, so very well put to write about old world, new world. But it really brings back the concept of Gotham City being a character and Metropolis being a character.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this issue 6 really comes forward. Like there's always establishing shots of Opal City, and I love Opal City. And he really thought it out because he mentions street names, he mentions neighborhoods, and way more so than in Gotham or Metropolis ever did.
Right. And I love the notion in the later issue where he's talking about how there's no suburbs. The city just ends, and then you're out in the county, out in the country.
Turk country.
Yeah. I thought it was a great visual that, it literally just stops there. And the way that I read these collected digitally, issue 0 has something from James Robinson where he talks about how Opal City was so important to him, and that some people might, turn their nose up at Gotham City and Metropolis, but he really felt like it was important to explore that. And I think as long as you understand the importance of those, I think there's a long way to go. I always feel like, depending on, when it comes to film, depending on who the filmmaker is, Gotham City either looks like New York or Chicago, but usually kind of somewhere right in between, and but it is interesting when you do feel like it's its own place. So I could see this. So, you're talking about Stargirl having the mantle of this. And I know that there was a Stargirl series on the CW, I believe. Have there been attempts to, and we're not talking about the great Jeff Bridges film Starman, were there attempts that you were aware of to try and adapt this, or has it just never really been something to happen?
I had not, to my knowledge. Actually, no, wait. I think there was vague talks when in 2011, when Dan Nelson became president of DC Comics, and DC was moved more fully into Warner Brother fold a bit. There were still lots of talks about the movies and the ill-fated Green Lantern movie, which we won't talk about. But I think at one point there was talk of doing a Starman movie.
Well, because we've been talking about this in sort of the way that you chose for us, basically, Jeb, that we would talk about 0 through 11 because it is that first year, and it's not always the case where a year of a comic feels like a season of a TV show, but it really does. I mean, you feel like the nature of it would translate very well. I don't know. It's a character like Starman, so you always wonder, it's not the right tier. You know what I mean? You need to really, I don't know. I mean, Disney did have their own streaming service for a moment. I almost said something that I realized they had that DC universe that got rolled into HBO Max, now Max. So yeah, I think just because of the visuals, it would be amazing for some kind of like gritty animated series like this. And I definitely find the Shade to be somebody that I'm sort of fascinated by him as a character because of the flashback stories like this one, and just the notion that it's teased in this issue, and then he reveals like, oh yeah, well, the Portrait of Dorian Gray is actually based on a kind of a real guy that you got to keep an eye out for. I don't know. I find that stuff that's all happening in the background behind the scenes to be fascinating. What did you think, Eric, about these stories, specifically this one, that it does not advance our main storyline for Starman? He's barely in it. Jack, I'm talking about. But
any excuse to get Oscar Wilde into a comic book, I'd say you got to do it.
I by the way, I do want to check how many comic books has Oscar Wilde been in. It's a short number. It's a small number.
I think he had a run in Deadpool at one point as well.
But that wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
But this storyline, though, I thought was great. And then at the end, that one panel which you just had up, which was basically, maybe I didn't need to kill them all. I thought was like, wow. That and you didn't even necessarily see that he did this, but
yeah,
if you look closely, you see there's like bodies below that skull. And so I thought, as an aside, as kind of like a side, I don't know, a sidecar or whatever to the main story, I thought this one was great. And I agree, Shade is fascinating. He's one of those villains. Oh God, imagine like, I don't know, an Alan Rickman or someone playing him. Like he just would have. It would have been so wonderful to see him in a movie or a TV show at some point. Maybe there's still hope in the future. I mean, there's plenty of DC titles coming down the pike.
Yeah.
But,
no, I mean, you never know when somebody gets in James Gunn's ear and he's like, actually, Shade's an amazing idea. That is somebody that we should focus on.
And the whole, it also gave me a little bit of, if you guys saw the movie Nightmare Alley, this storyline gave me a lot of this sort of Nightmare Alley vibes as well, which I thought was a kind of an underrated film, one I thought was really quite good. So if you're into this, I would recommend go check out Bradley Cooper's film, which was really quite terrific.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that it's within the confines of the all important Comics Code Authority, but it is some slightly more adult storytelling. There's the fact that Jack, we don't see it, but he mentions the one night stand with the octopus lady, and she's like, this isn't going to go anywhere, and he's like, well, yeah, obviously you're an octopus lady, and no, he didn't say that, but I can see that thought process. It's like, yeah, I wasn't gonna settle down with you, but and then there's even for it being the mid 90s, there's occasional references, a woman who gets sucked into the poster talking about she's clearly just gotten out of a relationship with a woman. There's references to the sort of the way this run ends. the character who's in jail, and I wish I had taken better notes so that I could remember her name, but I'm sure Jeb will tell me who that is.
Oh God, I don't remember.
The sister character.
Nash.
Yeah. She's talking about obviously the ways she went to gain favor in prison involved men and women. And when it's stories told in the modern day, you don't even blink twice. But whenever you see little things like that creeping in, and again, to reference Sandman, you definitely had some references to that. And you always had to be very subtle with everything. But it's just interesting to sort of see that. But then also, dirty cop finding a way to get ladies of the evening in his bed, and all kinds of really cool stuff that we got to see.
And, and in typical Starman fashion, the O'Dare family, the cop, that is hugely pivotal to the story. The O'Dares are integral to the entire story. All of them are.
Now, is that just a product of this 90s series, or were they always involved in,
I think that was early? No, the O'Dare family was like the Opal City, and that, I think, to my knowledge, is all James. So,
right. That's interesting.
But yeah, he made a living, breathing city. So.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it is a great character, and I think the stories are incredibly well told. I think Jack as the reluctant hero, that can go a number of different ways, but I think that his story is well told, and I think it's done incrementally in a way of like, I still don't want to go out looking for trouble, but I'm not going to lie, it felt good to stop a bank robbery or something. You know what I mean? So I kind of like the way it unfolds. Eric, I'm going to flip through some more of your pictures before we say goodbye. But what are some of the other thoughts that you have as we kind of start to wind down here?
I mean, no one would confuse him, with Deadpool. But I thought the asides were good. It was just almost like just the right amount of kind of modern pop culture, but then old school culture. At one point, he had a reference to Fred McMurray, who's from Father Knows Best.
My Three Sons,
right? And The Apartment. I'm like, well, you don't expect
specifically My Three Sons is why he's talking about him. Not because
I know.
The Apartment.
I went deeper. Damn it.
All right, but just trying to show off.
Oscar Wilde and Fred McMurray tend not to make their way into many 90s comics. So any comic that had room for both of them and Starsky and Hutch, but then also, had a kind of like a love for another era of comics. Was it the Justice Society shows up, including the old school Flash, which I'm a big fan of the Justice Society. I just love the old school feel and look of them. And so they pop up in here, and it makes sense. Like, it doesn't feel forced or campy or just, I don't know, some kind of bizarre fan service. Like, all these choices that were made within this comic felt right for this comic. And I think that was a really interesting combination. I had a mix of tones and styles. It could be a little cheeky at times, a little, 90s kind of like a Gen X, like whatever kind of guy. And then could flip it into something that is completely from, that you could have seen in a 1940s or 50s comic. So I think this was a real treat, one that I would not have, I don't know if I would have known about it. I guess I knew about Starman just because he has appeared in things. I know the Justice Society, I know Stargirl, but the fact that I had to sit down and read 12 issues of it was a real treat. So Jeb, I just want to say thank you for pitching this first and foremost, and really the work. I don't know. It's just great to hear that this is something you grew up loving, or at least in your later years fell in love with, and then got to work on it professionally. I don't know. It's just nice to hear a good guy getting to do something that makes the job feel a little less like a job.
Yeah, that's what it was. So I treasure those specific. I have specific books in my career that I'm very proud of, and this is one of them. So
we'll bring you back only to talk about the ones you hated working on, but that'll be another episode.
That's a different conversation. Well, Eric should go ahead.
But I don't know if I'll get to work in comics anymore if I talk about those books.
No, we'll give you a mask and we'll change your voice.
Eric, you should thank him for inspiring your Halloween costume. You said,
this look for me, Halloween 2025. Maybe not this year. I got to wait another year. But yes, this I feel like I'm just a robe away from being him.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like you have the robe, and we all know you definitely have the slippers. So
the slippers I'm wearing them right now.
Oh, well, Jeb, it has really been fun to kind of just pick your brain sort of about your experiences and just, an aspect of it that I think a lot of us don't necessarily think about. Obviously, we know that something goes into putting those collections together, but to actually hear about it is very interesting. And I hope that people who appreciate this show appreciate that sort of stuff. Take a moment to talk again about your company and what you do and how people can find out more. And sorry, but Eric's wife popped in to talk about the purple slippers.
Is this the first time
she's never showed up on any of these shows?
I like to think she's coming up to see me.
I think it is, by the way, because she sure doesn't come to see me
or me,
and we all know she doesn't come to see Eric. Yeah,
nah, Jeb, you're the steak and the sizzle.
My company is Creative Apocrypha. Sadly, I have no website yet because I'm too busy. I'm too busy working. I literally started the company and just went straight to work, and it's on my to-do list. But I have been so busy with doing more collections. As I said, I have a team of artists who I work with, and we provide creative services and production services to comics and tabletop industry, games industry, to help. If you don't want to do creative, we can do it for you, or you don't know how to do something, we can do it for you. See, it's because of me. See,
and Mrs. Conner confirming that it is indeed because of Jeb. I think, Lauren, we all knew that was why you were here. It certainly wasn't for Eric. I wanted to pretend it was for me, but I also knew it wasn't for me. So for Geekscape Book Club, we will be back next month. We're going to talk about a newer entry, which we don't usually read a lot of those, but it just sort of tumbled into my path. And we're going to be talking about Dark Web, which was a newer Spider-Man X-Men mashup, which it's fun to see characters that I used to read as a kid, but it's a little in the weeds. There's a lot of stuff that I'm just like, I'm going to brush past that. And there is one team up moment that in that series that I think was done just for me that we'll talk about when we talk about Dark Web, involving Spider-Man and a couple of prominent mutants, but we'll save that for next month. Check your local listings. I don't know what day in August that'll be yet, but hopefully by then, Eric, get ready. Hopefully by then we'll be able to announce what we will be able to discuss on a panel at LA Comic-Con in early October for this show. I know we missed last year, but I would like to get another one of these panels there. So we'll talk about that. Next month, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChristianDMZ, my personal podcast, The Blattcast, BLADTCAST. And right here on Geekscape, our show Marvel Movie Talk. We are going to be doing a lot of Marvel movie talking over the next few weeks about Deadpool and Wolverine with a variety of different guests. So subscribe to the Geekscape YouTube channel or subscribe to the audio version of not only this show, but also our show Marvel Movie Talk. Eric Conner, where do you want people to keep an eye on you and all of your wares, as it were?
Come on by Insta or X, Count Eric Conner. Say hello, say goodbye, say whatever you want to say that's appropriate to post.
And we will, as I said, we'll see you in August for Dark Web. And as we always like to say, as long as they keep writing them, we'll keep reading them. See you next month, everybody.